So today we will discuss a little bit more about AI, but still not the last way where we show you really the ins and outs of ChatGPT, how it works. So I will pave the way slowly to the ethics, the use of AI, why it can become a problem in the future. So we will discuss about some of the misconduct that we briefly talked in the beginning of this group of seminars, but not all of you were here, so I had uh, the belief that this is important to retake. Why, what are the consequences, the causes, of course, it's really important. Why people sometimes behave not properly. And one important point is we have gray zones. So things are obviously not appropriate. Certain things are okay, but there is some gray zone where we don't know if this is okay or not, and we just don't talk much about it, and we use it. Nobody tells uh, others that are using AI, etc., etc. And this is what can become a problem, right? The fact that we do not discuss about it, we do not open the box, and what I see is getting more and more common. And I saw for the first time actually the past week is people saying, I used AI and I used for that. This is becoming common. The journals are requiring you to do that. And I saw for the first time it was in a proposal. And I believe the fact I believe the fact that the person in the proposal was a foreigner and the proposal was pristine with respect to the language. Then the person said, I use the AI for correcting my grammar, etc. Because it's obvious that it's impossible for someone to dominate a language such as French. English is easy, no? But French, Portuguese is simply impossible. It really takes a lot of time, and there's always one or other mistakes or words that are not exactly fitting to that language, and we can figure out that this was not a native, right? It's easy. So the people, this guy was a foreigner. He was writing a proposal for a Brazilian grant, and his proposal was pristine. So at the end, he put a disclosure. I use the AI tools to correct grammar mistakes. So I see this will be like the trend. So starting today's class, we already are in the fifth class. All the slides are accessible. Pretty much, if all we need is to know this tiny URL, and then we have the dates. Some of the dates were taken, that's why there's some A at the end, and you just can quickly write down these last letters, and you will access the slides just like I'm presenting here. I will take this opportunity to make some propaganda. We did not diffuse yet. We are just in the last arrangements, but we will have the AI Day. It will be on March 30th, Monday, and we will have two talks. One talk is with Professor Vasilis from NCAA, and that is Professor Vasilis was, like me, a fellow in residence in 2019, 2020. He's from Greece, and he joined CY in the past few years, and he's now working with LPPI with a project, a joint project, to use AI tools to develop science. So I think it's a nice talk for all of you to attend. And it's important. It doesn't matter if you are experimentalist. You know, sometimes one of the things that we will discuss today, which is okay to use AI, is to use it as a chat to plan experiments, exchange ideas. What do you think about this project? And etc. Give me a suggestion. What could I do? This is okay. So Vasilis will talk, of course, much more about the use of codes and etc. But he also touched on this point. We will have a coffee break, and then we'll have Professor Michele Linardi, and he will be talking about AI and teaching slash learning, which I also think is really important for us to understand what kind of uses are okay, are good. If you are training, if you are trying to learn something new, how much you should trust AI in the sense of uh, giving you some suggestions on how to learn, etc. For example, he will discuss about computer programs, learn a programming language, how much you should uh, address to the AI, give the AI the freedom to do your programs, and how much you really need to learn. Because imagine if you create a program, ask AI to create a program for you, and you have very little notion of what is in there. If there are bugs, how can you correct it? How can you even realize there is a bug? Right? In the beginning of ChatGPT, teenagers that could barely write were doing, for example, nasty things like with respect to cyber security. Why? Because they go to ChatGPT, write me a program to uh, do denial of service. And ChatGPT write the code, you copy, you run, and make things. And it was just after some time that ChatGPT, the company, starts to create some blocks to not allow such things happen in their platform. So please take your notes to your agenda. We will diffuse a quick questionnaire just to figure out how many of you will come, so we have enough food for the coffee break and for the lunch. And I ask you to reply so we can account it properly. So today we are in our fifth class. We will discuss about ethics in scientific research, publication, and then start to discuss about the AI use. The last class, I will start pretty much teaching or trying to explain how ChatGPT works. So the idea is to try to really go inside the box, figure out what is ChatGPT. We start to hear, for example, there is a neuroscientist from Brazil. He's really critics of ChatGPT, and he said, "Oh, it's incredible that this program, people are putting so much trust in the program, which the basic principle is to generate the next word using statistics." You probably have heard about that many times. ChatGPT is a statistic program. The only function is to figure out what is the next word. And it goes next word by next word, and it creates a story. Well, I think it's, of course, very oversimplified, this idea. ChatGPT is way more than predicting the next word, because if it was just like that, I think it will not be as powerful as we see it is. But indeed, there is some sense in this sentence. So the idea is how we can explain how ChatGPT works, how ChatGPT was trained. This is really important, right? Because imagine sometimes when I'm at home and discussing with my kids. I have two teenagers, and they say something, and I said, "What was the source?" YouTube. Because that's the point. What is the source? You're saying something, and who told you that? Was just someone that was creating stories from their minds, or it's some specialist, etc. So it's important to know how it works and how far can we go, giving ChatGPT freedom in our research, in our daily lives, to generate knowledge to us. Okay, so let's go to the ethics. I pointed out few subjects here: ethics in scientific research, research integrity, in the publications, preparation of scientific manuscript, and then we'll go a little bit into the use of AI. So ethics in scientific research. So far, I think it's really clear to you that the science is not just production of papers or production of technical data. It's really a social institution, and when public trust collapses, everything else follows, right? Funding, public influence, policy influence, scientific authority, everything goes to the drain. So the scientists, they really push a very important effort to keep science ethics, to make sure that the people who are playing some not so ethic games, they are excluded, because this is really what supports science. The idea that the society really trusts what we do. So I picked up these ethics, which really comes from bioethics, these classical principles of science. And the point is, sometimes when we look especially to the first four, we do not see much of what this impacts us that do technical science. Most of these points that are more related to bioethics, where it really came from. But having some experience nowadays, I can see examples of research that I saw in the past that from the beginning, if you had thought about these points, these ethical points, you would realize they will not go through. And one example is, all of you know oligothiophenes, right? Oligothiophenes is a 5-member ring, carbon, 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 and a sulfur. This is the workhorse of organic semiconductors. Very stable molecule. It's used for a lot of things. One day, some chemists had the idea of using not sulfur, but selenium and tellurium. So just go down in the periodic table. So what are the selenophenes, the telluriophenes? So they synthesized it. They saw some nice properties, but they knew these were highly toxic. So from the beginning, even if these molecules, these materials would work very nicely for the application they were thinking, even from the beginning they could say, well, we will not work with that because it's really toxic, right? So there are some bioethics principles that can help you to guide your research, even though they are way more stronger when you are doing social sciences and research with humans and etc. So, for example, the first principle, the beneficence, the idea is the research should produce benefits, advance knowledge or the society. So the idea that I always tell you to make a good bibliographical review, because trivial or redundant, reinventing the wheel should be avoided, right? You should do something, put your time in something new, not redoing a research that someone else did. So one point that I really want to stress is not all research has the obligation to generate immediate application. I see the funding agencies pushing really strongly this agenda that you should have an application. I myself, right now, I am trying to write a proposal, and I had two subjects I could concentrate. One, what I have been doing for the past 20 years. Another, something new using AI that has some applications. I selected the second because in the call, they already asked, what is the level of maturity of your technology? Well, basic research is really low, the level of maturity for technology, right? So we see the financing agencies pushing this agenda. But it's really dangerous, a really dangerous agenda, because we know after looking, when we look back to history of science, we know things that have been developed by mathematicians, for example, fractal concepts, etc. In the beginning, they just study that with the idea of geometry, etc. And nowadays they use fractal concepts to extract petroleum, things that are really practical. But in the beginning, they never imagined they could have a quite practical application for these mathematical tools. So uh, the idea is that really it may contribute meaningfully to the knowledge, but don't feel pressed to really have something that will generate an immediate application. The principle of non-maleficence, the idea is to do no harm. And here's are the 2 points that I mentioned to you with respect to the selenophene examples. The risks, assess the risks before action and minimize foresee damage. So it's really important to look at the possible effects if this material that you generate has some toxicological problems or things like that, right? The risk ethics examines more the moral justification of exposing individuals, communities, societies to potential harm in pursuit of knowledge, innovation, or benefit. So really, this point is related more closely to exposing individuals. So, for example, now for the first time, I'm doing a research that we have to interview kids in high school. So the study is related to cybersecurity and what is the knowledge that kids, the teenagers nowadays, they have about the scams related to cybersecurity. You cannot imagine how many ethics committees had to evaluate this research and etc. and figure out all the procedure, if it's anonymized, if it's not, etc. etc. So when you go through this road, this ethics principles is way more, I would say, strict. Autonomy, again, more related to research with humans, informed concept, freedom to withdraw, respect for participants. So when you are conducting research involving people, then you have to observe the concepts of autonomy. The justice, fair risk distribution, avoid the exploitation, inclusive design. So the idea of really including everyone in your research and asking the questions, who bear the risks, who receive the benefits. It's important point. And the last one, which was actually not part of the 4 initial principles, it was added after, is really what touches us the most, which is the principle of transparency. We have discussed in other classes the idea of method clarity, honest reporting, and this point, this is not really that we think about it often, but it's really important. Is conflict disclosure. We will discuss more about that during this class. the first time I really thought about that, we always, when we submit papers, you have to select one or two boxes talking about disclosure, if you have any conflict of interest, etc. I just click no conflict, no conflict. I have conflict with no one. No one gave me money, nothing, right, to publish that. But one time, I realized how important is all these boxes. And this was when I was discussing with a researcher that happened to have a dog. And we were discussing about a product that people say it's good to give to our dogs to avoid ticks and etc. And he said, look, do you know how many papers are published about this product? I said, no, I have not any time I have done research about that. Oh yeah, there's just one paper. One paper, yes. And all the scientists, they work in the company that produce the medicine. Mm-hmm. And you know, after doing the research, they killed 16 beagles and said, I will never use this product. Oh, this part is sad, but you know, they had the idea was to look at the liver of the dogs to see if they had an impact on the liver. But the conflict of interest is obvious. Imagine if you produce a drug, you work in a company that you produce a drug, you find that this drug is no good, and you publish a paper saying that. Does it make any sense? Even if the drug is good, you cannot have something like that. No, it's an obvious conflict of interest. So when we start to think about that, then we realize how important it is to bring this subject into the publication. And then transparency prevents distortion of scientific records and guarantees public ethics. Ethics strengthens methodology and reflects scientific maturity. So this ethics point will touch many subjects that we will discuss today. So scientific integrity and research misconduct. So what is the idea of scientific integrity? Honesty in data, reproducibility, accurate documentation, and accountability. Accountability is now the point that is touching more and more the idea of AI use. So if you use AI and something that's not good happens, who will blame? In Brazil, when we have problems with the bank system, we always blame who? Is the system, is the bank system. Well, but there is someone behind the bank system, right? There is someone to blame, not this system. So AI is not an author. It will never be an author of your paper. So if something you used, you got the text, you use AI, something bad happens, you are the one to blame. So this is something that we'll have to make clear from the beginning. So science depends really on faithful representation of what is done. So the idea is we will discuss these 4 points of clear misconduct, and make sure you all know exactly what each one means. So let's start with plagiarism. Who has any idea what plagiarism? You can feel free to just say what you have in mind. What is plagiarism?
Is to take the same idea from someone or like write exactly the same sentence without like changing word but meaning.
Two very important points that you mentioned. First, use someone's idea, right? And copy and paste something that you took from someone's paper, right? This second point, for example, it's interesting because you believe that sometimes that if you put the reference to that sentence, you will not be producing plagiarism. Why? Because you said, this is not my idea, this is that person's idea. And this is really common. This practice is common, especially in law. neuroscience and human sciences, right? So one time I have a friend who produced his master dissertation, and he asked me to do a review, and I took his dissertation, put in a plagiarism check, and it highlighted lots of places. And I told him, look, you have to change these sentences. You have to write with your own words. No, but I cited. Yes, yes, you cited. But this paper is yours. Everything that's written here it has to come from your mind, from um, your words. So you have to rewrite the text. So usually when he's writing, for example, his documents, he quotes, etc. There's a special environment because you have to use the same words, right? If you take a law, you cannot rewrite the law. You have to use the words. So, but here is different. But I have a question for you. Imagine someone is discussing with you and give you a good idea. And after that, you forget. But then one fine day, you wake up, I have a great idea. And you go there and you put in practice. Was this plagiarism? And yes, this was plagiarism. And this is the most difficult plagiarism that we can detect. Because truly, you can think that this was your idea. You just heard someone in a conference giving one idea and you forgot. And after that, boom, this came up in your mind. Eureka, oh, I had a great idea. So this is one important source. Another point, if you made a figure, for example, for your paper, and after you want to write a review paper, can you use this figure? It was you that you did. It's your own copyright, right? In other words, can you commit auto-plagiarism? Plagiarism, who the person you are plagiarizing is yourself. Can you commit that? Is this possible? Yes. So this is something that sometimes we believe it's not possible, but why you can commit plagiarism against yourself? Because at the moment you publish a paper, one of the boxes that you tick, and if you do not tick, the paper will not be published, is giving to the journal the copyright of everything that's written there. So at the end, it's no longer your figure, your text belongs to the journal, right? And then if you want to use your figure, can you? Yes, most of the time you can, but you have to ask the journal, can I use the figure I did for my paper that was published? Oh, but this is really complicated. Imagine if every time, yeah, most of the time, when the journals, they have a form, and you ask, you point what is the use of that. If the use is academic, you're preparing a class, you're writing a paper, etc., it's automated. You just click, you have the form giving you the authorization. Most of the time, may have some human interaction if you say you are going to sell it or write a book or etc. But if it's for our general use, the answer is immediate. So plagiarism is defined as presenting another person's ideas, words, or results as your own without proper attribution. So when you take all the knowledge of that person and you never mention this person, this is really a very bad fault, right? Sometimes you just do not cite this person's work as often as properly that should be proper, and this is like a minor issue. And the auto-plagiarism is also a minor issue. But, for example, I had a situation like that. We submitted a abstract to a conference, but at the end, it transformed into an extended abstract. And my student he was preparing a paper, he submitted this extended abstract with methodology, etc., etc. Then we submit the paper. And some parts of the methodology were just copy and paste from the extended abstract. The software, all journals, they have this plagiarism software, detected plagiarism. It raises the flag, the editor opens up, see what's going on, identify that this auto-plagiarism is a plagiarism of someone just copy and paste the same person's production in the past, and say, okay, you can rewrite it. I give you this opportunity to you. But the problem is, the person who will referee the paper, he doesn't know it's an auto-plagiarism. It receives the invitation saying there was a sign of plagiarism. So he just will not give any review on a paper at all. People have feared to participate in something like that. So at the end, paper was not published in that journal because of that. Right? All the reviewers, they were assigned. No, I don't want to do that. Quit, and I keep going, and at the end, sorry, I couldn't find reviewers to your book. So the idea is really never copy and paste, never, even if it's yourself, it's methodology, something minor, you have to rephrase all the time, rewrite. And this is actually something that people are using sometimes AI to rewrite paragraphs and things like that. Fabrication, I think, is obvious. We discussed one case where the postdoc in the Bell Labs, he really with intention, he produced data to publish, clearly a fault, and at the end, when they realize what he has done, his scientific life simply ended. But what we will see is the fact that even if the paper is retracted, the time when the paper were there, a little short time, people spend time to understand, to reproduce, etc., to make models, and based on fake data. So the contamination of that paper in the literature did not stop when the paper was retracted. It was interesting because at that time when this Bell Labs scandal was going on, we just heard, I was in the States, I just heard rumors of what was going on. But at that time, I had a very important paper in submission in a physical review letters, which is the top journal in physics. And one of the recommendations of the referee was remove all citations to shown. I don't know why, but later all his papers were retracted. But you see, the paper is retracted, but all the papers that have been published using the data, it's impossible to follow, right? So this will last in the literature for a long time. Falsification, even worse, right? Really manipulate research material, equipment, process to misinterpret results. And this last one, duplicate publication. What's that? That's what is duplicated publication. I teach also in a program in Brazil that is a master's program, but it requires a publication of an article at the end for you to defend, you present your thesis. And master's program is 2 years, is tight, right, the time. And every semester I get from one of my students, what about we submit this paper to 2 conferences, and the one who accepts first, we just take it. And after that, we say, no, this one is not good. So this is an example of 100% duplicate publication, right? So you submit to two journals. This is really not acceptable. And as I will show, journals may even ban you from publishing if they figure out you submit that paper to another journal. The strategy may look interesting, right? You just could cut time. Sometimes a paper spend months in the review process. So you could speed up by submitting to two, and whoever accepts first, you take it, right? But the problem is there are lots of stuff related to that. For example, using the already exhausted referee system to give some opinions about one paper, and at the end you just will trash it if you accept the other journal acceptance, right? Yes.
If we submit like an abstract to a more conference and we use like for two different conferences, is this like to prevent the publication? Or?
Very good question. The point is, an abstract is not seen as a publication in the sense that we see articles, right? So most of the time, going to two conferences with the same work, let's say, is not a great fault, right? In my point of view. The point is really when you get this document, let's say, into a journal that will be reviewed, that the idea is unique, right? You should present like a unique paper, right? And especially when you go through the submission process, and this is something I suggest you to do. Next paper you have or the first paper you have, ask your advisor, let's submit together. Oh, would you give me the rights to submit this paper? Because it's really didactical, it's really interesting. Because one of the questions that you have to check there is this paper was not submitted to anyone anywhere else. You have to check that, otherwise things will not go. This box is not there in the conference, right? When you submit an abstract, they do not ask, have you presented this in another conference? No, because of course, ideally you would have a new presentation or a new project or for each conference. But sometimes they are too close to each other. And at the end of the day, I would say it will not never be the same, right? Because the minimum amount of time that you have between one and the other, you add a little more of text and etc. But I would say in the abstract, just in the abstract world, having the same abstract in two conferences will not be a mistake. Of course, if you can rewrite, the more you rewrite that makes them different, the better. And one point that you should be is an exception to that is, as I mentioned, sometimes the abstracts are published, right? So they have like a book of abstract that you have a ISBN number, so it would be more close to what is a paper. So in this case, they may run a plagiarism check and find you as the author of another abstract that was very similar. Very rare. Usually the conference that we go is just 250 abstract words, right? I never saw something like that. But to make sure, rephrase it. Never just copy and paste the same abstract. That's the bottom line. So duplicate publication is, of course, when you have two papers in two different journals, sometimes to cut the time of publication, but also when you have what we call the substantially similar content. What is that? It's another misconduct that you figure out, which is what they call the salami science. So what is the salami science? You take the salami is your research, and instead of putting everything, the whole salami into a complete article, you cut into slices and you present just a little bit in one paper, then a little bit more in another paper, then a bit more in the other paper, to have more papers, right? So sometimes we have seen in the literature, when I started doing research, the A-scenes series were really important at that time. So naphthalene, anthracene, tetracene, pentacene. We published a paper with all these molecules, very long paper looking at all molecules with all properties. And then we realized there was a researcher in Japan. He developed some methodology, but then he published for naphthalene, one paper, and we got it to review. 1 month after, anthracene. And when we saw that, oh, come on, he will publish one paper for each molecule. And of course, when you do that, it's really difficult to write a completely new paper if what the only thing that changes is the molecule. So at the end, this is, a kind of duplicate publication, because at the end of the day, you could definitively join everything into just one complete paper. Okay, what is the gray zones? And as we will discuss later, the AI enters in this gray zone. Selective reporting, p-hacking, salami slicing, inadequate citation, and I will put use of AI between quotes. Of course, it depends on what is the use of AI. These gray zones is what usually called questionable research practices. So what it means? You see in the literature, yes. Is it a misconduct? No, not really. But people sometimes look at you, this guy, oh, he participate into these citation groups. What is that? You cite my papers, I cite your papers, so we don't have auto citation, but my citation record is inflated by you and this person. So this kind of like the gray zone, which is important that you to learn. So what is selective reporting? We already discussed briefly that in the past is what we call the cherry picking. So you have many devices, you have many run the experiment many times, and instead of reporting all of them using statistics, using an average value and things like that, you just pick what was the best, right? So this is very common in experimental sciences, and the community sometimes creates barriers against that. One of the examples I mentioned, for example, in the case of organic photovoltaics, they said, now you can just publish efficiency if you have at least so many data points. You have to present the average, the standard deviation, etc., etc. You do not accept just one point that you mentioned is the average, but it's actually the best of a batch, right? So the community tries to prevent that. So the idea is, why is problematic? It distorts the scientific record, right? And when the negative results are hidden, other research try to reproduce, they just repeat, and it never come like yours. It overestimates the sizes of the effects, and people that do theory, they just end up developing flawed theories, because that was really not the average, as you mentioned, or the scientists mentioned. It was just the best value, right? What we today we call it an outlier sometimes in AI. P-hacking. The P-hacking, the idea is that this P value is related to statistics. So it's it came long ago. So they're saying that the p-value measures the probability of observing data at least as extreme as what was found, assume the null hypothesis is true. So the idea is statistically, when you have this p smaller than 0.05, is statistically significant. But this number, it's known, it's not an universal truth. So even if you study many data points, sometimes you do not study enough. And you may just say, oh no, my p-value is okay, I'm within the range of okay, but it's really not, right? So hacking the p-value means you present a result saying that you did some statistics, but you really forced a bit that very good value, right? So the idea is it inflates the false positive results. And in this case, what is the point that's not interesting? It makes difficult the reproducibility and the scientific credibility of your research. The salami slices, the slicing, as I mentioned, is the idea of dividing one paper into multiple smaller publications, right? To increase the publications count. So right now, there is a discussion going on in my department in Brazil because they are trying to recreate the web page, and the web page starts something like that. I am blah, blah, blah. I have published so many papers. My index H is that, and my number of citations is that. And there are some professors that are really mad. Oh, no, come on. We are way more than these numbers, and etc., and etc. But indeed, these metrics they have been used to classify, for example, the level of scientists, right? When you have a proposal and there's like an evaluation of the proposal and an evaluation of the coordinator, you take the coordinator as a scientist, what you look? These numbers, number of publications, number of citations, etc. So people sometimes they try to inflate these numbers, and one of the ways is salami slicing. So the idea is fragment the scientific understanding. You could create just a very nice comprehensive paper, but you slice it into many, and creates also redundant literature. So it's already, we have so many papers to read. Imagine if you take one paper divided into many, right? Inadequate citation. So inadequate citation, as I mentioned, what was the point? They created this citation index, which is something that it's interesting because, for example, you could evaluate the importance of journals, right? You probably have heard about the impact factor of a journal. What is the impact factor? At the end of the day, you just take the number of citations of the papers in that journal for a period of 2 years, and you divide by the number of papers. How the impact factor was created? He said there was shortage of money to pay for the subscription of the journals, and then the library said we have to create a priority list. How they create the priority list? With the impact factor. The point is this impact factor now is moving to evaluate scientists. How? For example, in Brazil, they sum up the impact factors of the journals you have published to evaluate, to give you some more. So when they want to rank scientists, they sum up the impact factors for a period of years, and they have a number that they can use to rank scientists. So to try to hack this, what they did, for example, excessive self-citation. So in the beginning, some people did that, and you look at your citations, you have lots of citations, but then people realize they were doing that on purpose. So there are some for example, Scopus, Web of Science, and things like that, they exclude your self-citations. And when you see these two numbers, they are quite different for, of course, certain people, right? The idea, one that's more complicated is what they call citation cartels. That's more complicated. Why? Because you do not auto-cite yours, but you ask someone to cite your papers, and that person cites your papers. Quite often, more often than usual, right? It sounds like in Brazil, for example, the politics, they have some money to hire people. And they have this rule that's called nepotism. So you cannot hire someone from your family, right? So what you do? Okay, you hire my niece and I hire your niece. That's it, or something like that, right? So it's kind of the citation cartels. So why this is not good? Because you ignore contradictory literature. For example, you inflate your numbers, right? The scientific recognition, etc. So strategic citation to impress editors. This is also sometimes it's used. I remember I was once in a paper. It was really interesting. So the guy did some work and he submitted to Nature. He thought Nature, that work had the impact for Nature, and Nature refused. Common, right? Nature accepts for reviewing 3% of the paper. But then he had in mind, I don't know where he found that, he had this idea, that usually it's much easier for someone to publish the second Nature paper than the first. So he came up to my boss at the time and said, look, you have many Nature papers already. Please do some work. Let's try to find something in common so your name can go in. And then when you submit, you say, oh, this is guys common, it comes here many times, so of course. And it didn't work. They did that, they put together a paper, they submit to Nature, was not. So at the end, but of course, there are some people who think the citation, strategic citation, can impress the editors. In this case, it's more like you cite many important journals during your paper, right? Cite Science, Nature, etc., and then you think this may impress the editor, giving you more importance to your paper. So the idea is all these points, they distort the intellectual map of the research field. And AI use. What's the point of AI use? Right now, use AI is not a misconduct yet, but it can become one, right? AI is a legitimate research tool, but the problem is the ethical point comes from how it's used. And the most important aspect right now is the lack of consensus across journals and institutions. So one of the points is the boundary between assistance and authorship is unclear. So as I mentioned, you start to chat with AI to write your proposal, right? And AI gives you some ideas, you take some, you develop your own, you write the proposal. At the end, who was the author? So the boundary is really not clear. So the problem is misinterpretation, opacity, loss of accountability. So unlike the data fabrication, AI-assisted may involve real content, but the intellectual responsibility becomes blurry. Meaning, who was intellectually responsible? The AI, yourself? And the other point, which I think is really more complicated, is the potential of copyright conflicts. So as I will show in the next class, the last one, AI was trained with the entire internet. So the idea is basically right now, all the text produced by humans is inside ChatGPT. The AIs, they are trying to get trained from texts that are already generated by AI because they exhausted already what we humans create. So imagine if you have an output of an AI tool that it belongs to someone. It really, if you read the original, you read your own, it's clearly the same thing, right? And right now, there are some, we have plagiarism tools that are very efficient, but for example, they cannot detect, or they are very bad at detecting translations. Translations, something as simple as that. You take, I did that test. I took a paper in one language, translated using deep learning, DeepL, put in another language, gave to this authenticate software, which is one of the best, that says it can pick up translations, and didn't pick up. So imagine if you have a text that was translated from another language, right? And the point is, as we will see in the next class, for ChatGPT interpret what you ask, there is a parameter that's called temperature. It's a statistical parameter. And the idea is when, with this temperature, it can understand slightly different sentences, right? So if you ask a question, so in the past, 20 years, 30 years ago, the AI systems, for example, you had in the hospital, was more like that. You put the computer is there and asks, what is the temperature of the patient? And you click. The patient has some spots. Are they red? What's the size? When you click at the end, oh, the patient has blah, blah, blah. So this was not intelligent AI, right? It was just a table that he was looking up the answers and separating people. Now, you ask one question to ChatGPT, many different ways. It gives many different answers. The answers are not always the same. Actually, it's very difficult that the answer is exactly the same, but they are all similar. Why? Because of this temperature parameter. So the temperature, it allows ChatGPT to understand things that are similar and also to produce answers that are not always the same. They are very similar. So at the end of the day, if someone has wrote a paragraph in another language, it translates, it gives back this paragraph with the temperature effect. Nowadays, it's almost impossible for the plagiarism tools to detect they are the same. But this is today, right? And remember, when you publish a paper, it's there for the lifetime. So 30 years from now, you are on the verge of getting the Nobel Prize. Someone goes there, hack into a list of papers, AI mega tool, read all the papers from this person, make sure there was no plagiarism in any paper, and pull out a paper so long, many years ago, you wrote right in the beginning of your career that you're pressed to publish that paper to get your degree, and you copy without triple checking what ChatGPT did, and boom, it's exactly the same paper, this paragraph that someone has published in any language, etc. So that's what we are talking about. So two famous cases of misconduct. We discussed a little bit about Henry Shawn in the beginning. He was in the fields of in the field of organic semiconductors. This guy really just fabricated data. More than 20 papers were published and retracted. And this was not any paper. It was papers in Science, Nature, Physical Review Letters. And this guy was not anywhere. He was in the Bell Labs, one of the most important laboratories in the world, the one that came the transistor, right? And this was really a big scandal. For you to have an idea, the government of Japan sued the US government because they put money into this field of research because of the results published by Sean. Can you imagine? So this guy was publishing fancy results, important effects, and Japan said, oh, these materials are really great. They are just the next generation of materials. And they open up calls, etc., and put a lot of money, and then they realized it was all also everything was fake. So there was something like that. This other case, which is interesting, I suggest you, I have the references here, they are in Wikipedia, there's an entire page about that. This other case was known as the Andrew Wakefield MMR graphene scandal. This is the one relationship that this guy fakely came up relating the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine with autism. And this is interesting because 18 years ago, my son was born in the States. And there was a very strong society relationship with vaccines because of this scandal. So people had really big fear that there was some relationship between certain vaccines and autism. And it's interesting that, the scandal at the end, this guy, when they did all the research, basically all the points that I mentioned in misconduct, he checked all of them, right? Problem, he got money from someone at some hospital, etc. Lots of stuff. But at the end of the day, this effect, this resistance persists even until today. So you see there are communities that find some relationship. And I even have a friend, he said he believes strongly because he has a son with autism. And his son was born in the States. He took the shot and he said the day after, he was a little baby. The son was like moving like he did for every time. That movement, periodic movement, the autists, they do, right? And so they also mentioned that if the point that there are some mercury, I think it's like a material to prevent the aging of the vaccine in some old vaccines, no? That contains mercury and also can create autism, etc. But the point is, you see, one scandal in science, it can just propagate forever in the literature, in the society, and etc. Now, why fraud happens? Why you see there is a site on the internet that's called Retract Watch. And every day there's one paper that has been retracted. Every day. So this guy, he's just monitoring retraction papers. Why you have this kind of misconduct almost every day? Here are 3 points that I believe they are the main points. Public pressure, competition, and carrier incentives. In China, for example, when you publish papers in high-ranked journal, you get money, you get extra salary. And one professor who spent some time there, He said in that institution he visited, the amount of extra money that he got publishing papers were more than his salary. So you're not saying that is something like pocket money, small money. It's really something that can change your life. Publication pressure comes because of this system that I mentioned to you, that sometimes evaluate the profile of the researcher by the number of papers, the number of citations, and things like that, right? And competition. So, for example, in Brazil, when I presented myself to a professor position, I had no idea that I had to show how many papers I had published, etc. I just fill up the forms and that's it. That's me. I didn't shape my publication portfolio. It's what I am. My students, on the other hand, they already trying to find areas. No, this area I like it very much, but we don't publish much. And last position that opened, the guy who was hired, he had 20 papers. I only had two. Oh, I have to shape my career. So people are shaping their careers with respect to the publication record, and this has taken some the situation now. For example, in the past, you would present your curriculum, and indeed, the selected professors, they were the ones that published more. Now, I have heard that the committees, for example, they take the candidates and they take one paper out of the 20 sometimes. There are candidates that present to positions in the university where I am, that they have more papers published than professors that are retiring. So you have people that present with 20, 30 papers, just finishing their postdoc PhD. So the committee takes one paper out of the 30 and say, okay, let's talk about your role in this paper. Why? Because they figure out this thing. The people just produce papers, they participate into papers that they have no idea what's going on. They have a marginal participation just because of the competition and publication pressure. So the point when these kind of things happen is you have to bear in mind the cost of misconduct. So if you get caught, one of the things is retraction, but there is also the reputation damage, right? Your career may just be right there at the end. You didn't even start, it's already at the end. And of course, the public distrust, as I mentioned, right? This scandal that I mentioned in Bell Labs, the guy that was the professor who was the boss of the postdoc, I don't know if this is true, but I have heard that he was being quoted to a Nobel Prize. Of course, he was not quoted for a Nobel Prize because of that little thing that he was doing with his postdoc. He had a long history in science, but it was in another field, was in the field of magnetism. And after this scandal, of course, it was proved that everything was really the postdoc that did all the misconduct. But it took quite a while for him to appear in the community, and it really generated quite a bit of damage to his career, I would say. So we have to avoid this as much as possible. So publications as a scientific responsibility. So the publication communicates scientific knowledge. We need accuracy and transparency. One point that you have to keep in mind, publications become part of the permanent scientific record. So unless they find a misconduct in your publication, then your paper is retracted. What you publish will be there forever. Right? So we have to keep that in mind. Ethical in publication sustains the trust in science. And of course, if you have some misleading claims, this will generate a propagation of errors through the literature, as I mentioned. It's obvious that this will cause lots of problems in the future to other researchers, right? So the idea of ethics, authorship ethics, this is a very important subject that I bring because I'm sure you will face this situation in your career. I faced many times. Most of the time, I didn't even realize what was going on, and nowadays I have a completely different view. Probably I would give a different. I would have a different position when I faced this situation if I knew what I'm going to teach you now. So, first of all, authorship requires substantial intellectual contribution. What that means? The name of someone cannot appear in the paper just because this guy gave you his computer or his equipment to use. Oh, but to use that equipment, if we had no access to that equipment, the paper would simply not exist. So what do you say in a situation like that? Well, it's true. There are many names in papers published every day that the people did not substantially contribute intellectually to the paper. So this is violated. But this is just to tell you what we think is the right thing to do. So if maybe you are mad with this possibility, you can just speak up and say, look, this person didn't contribute intellectually to anything. So this person should not be mistaken. All authors must approve the final manuscript. Very important too. Why? There are situations, for example, this happened to me once. We had the paper almost finished, and the professor said, oh, I have a student, he just developed a methodology to treat this data. He will do some analysis and add something to the paper. Okay, he added. At the end, we submitted the paper. He realized we submitted a version that his advisor forgot to put his name. You cannot imagine how hard we had to go to say this name had to be in the paper. All authors had to sign authorization, consenting, etc., etc. Why? Because it just looks like someone paid, okay, I pay you that amount of money, you put my name on the paper. It's difficult for the editor to believe. So I know sometimes people do not reply to emails. I learned a strategy that's very good. It says, you write an email and say, look, that day I will submit the paper. If you do not reply me until the day before, I'm accepting your answer. It can be a strategy, right? But it's important that all authors approve the final manuscript. When you include the author in a paper, you have to include his name, his email, and all journals I know, they send a message to the email saying, your name has been included. If this was not the case, let me know. Most of the time, this was the case. So it's kind of a... And why? Why this is like that? Because all authors, they share the responsibility for the work. That's the reason. Right? If something happens, all authors will be blamed initially. We had many issues, just like Sean's case. Some very important journals, such as Nature, they require now that each one that's on the paper says what he or she did. So there's a paragraph that says, this author did that, this author did that, this author read, this author did that. So if you create something like that, the fake author that just gave access to the machine, etc., the editor may say, oh, this guy shouldn't be here. So at the end, what people have to do, they have to lie. right? Most of the time is, oh, this guy, he read the paper and gave some good ideas, and he didn't do anything. So someone had to write. But nowadays, some journals, they require this paragraph saying what each author did. So AI systems, they cannot be listed as authors. So authorship implies intellectual contribution to the conception, design, execution, or interpretation of the research. So this is actually the paragraph, more or less, that the journals that require this paragraph asks. Who contributes to the conception? This guy, etc. The design, the execution, etc. So everybody has to have a role in the paper. Here I put a link in the presentation to this book. FAPESP is the institution that finances the research in São Paulo, which is the biggest state in Brazil. They probably finance more than about half of the scientific research done in Brazil. And as they have so much research done by with their money, they put together this book that's available in Portuguese, Spanish, and English, which is an idea, some initial proposition of a good scientific practice code, right? It's a very thin book. You write in few minutes, not more than 1 hour. And I think it's a very good book for you to read and keep you in mind if you want to learn a little bit more about good scientific practice. And I like to show this extract that says, in a scientific work, authorship should include all and only researches that have made direct and substantial intellectual contribution to the design or execution of research and have given the express permission to be included. Specifically, the provision of financial and structural resources, such as laboratories, equipment, input, materials, human resources, institutional support, is not sufficient ground for being listed among the authors of the scientific works resulting from the research project. So, give money, scholarship, access to material, computer, etc., is not sufficient to be an author of a paper. Where this person who gave that should be cited. Exactly, in the acknowledgement. But what they are not, because they say, for example, I have heard this many times, they said, look, to keep this microscope, for example, running, I need money. To get money, I need good evaluation from the financial institution. To have a good evaluation, need what? Papers. So, if you want to use this equipment, my name has to be there. Otherwise, you will not have the microscope, I will not have the paper, but you also not have the paper. So, this is what happens in practice. But I just want you to know that this is not okay, right? And as I mentioned in the past, I had situations like that where I was author of one paper that I did the work, and sometimes my advisor just came up with some name. Oh, you should add blah blah blah. What? Okay, let's add blah blah blah. As long as I'm the first author, no problem. Oh, it's not okay. Right? Why these guys came up on this paper right now? So just to let you know. Conflicts of interest. So this is another important point that I said. As I mentioned, I never paid much attention to that, but I think it's important for you, especially if you are more in the experimental part and etc., to be aware of this problem. So the idea is like financial conflicts, institutional conflicts, personal or professional relationships. So the idea is, if there is some conflict of interest, they must be disclosed. For example, imagine that you did your work, as I mentioned in the case of the medicine for the dog. with some product that a company gave to you. They ask you to evaluate that material, right? So this may be a conflict of interest. And there's always a box that you should say if there is if you want to relate some conflicts of interest. So the journals, they require this disclosure, so readers can evaluate the findings with full knowledge of the potential influences. The peer review ethics. So what is the idea of the peer review ethics? First of all, the manuscripts, they are confidential, right? So most likely you already got, or you'll be soon, when you start to publish, your name goes in the journals, and the editors may take your name to evaluate some papers. So you get an invitation for review. So the idea is you have to be impartial in your evaluation. Most of the time, the reviewer name is hidden from the author. The idea is really to produce a constructive feedback and respect the intellectual property. Of course, you may have already read reviewers from your papers, right? And you may not have seen things like that going on, impartial evaluation, and etc. We are humans, and that's what we work. But the idea is to try to be as fair and as objective as possible when you review a paper. The duplicate submission that I mentioned before is when you think you may gain time by submitting to two journals. This wastes editorial and reviewer resources, and this is why it's very bad seen by the journals. It violates the editorial trust. Why? Because there is one box that you have to mark, and you have to say if this manuscript is being reviewed by someone else. And if you do not click this mark, if you say yes, it probably will not go through, right? So if you submit to two journals, at least for one you have to lie, right? And this is not good. It's explicitly prohibited by most journals, and the consequences can be, of course, rejection, and even worse, blacklist. So whenever I try to publish a paper in that editor, not only that journal, may be rejected. So should be avoided. Citation ethics. The idea is to cite relevant prior work. It depends if the person was not friendly with you, just relevant. Avoid excessive self-citation. As I mentioned, to inflate sometimes the own citation records, authors cite themselves in the paper, but at the end of the day, most of the citation index nowadays, they do not count auto citation. So it will not work, right? They will just drop these numbers. Avoid the citation cartels. And the idea is to represent previous works accurately. Now here comes a point that it's very important to you to hear about, which is this predatory journals. What is that predatory journal? Have you heard about them? This term? So, one fine day, some journal had the brilliant idea of saying, look, the way things are going on right now is that you publish a paper in my journal and you do not pay. But the person who reads your paper has to pay, right? You probably have tried to search a paper online, and you here in this institution they do not have the subscription, and you click, oh, you can pay. 40 euros, 100 euros. What? 100 euros to access one paper? No, I can live without that. You have seen that already. So these journals said, oh, let's do something. Let's make the author pay the fee. And once the author pays a fee that can be as high as something like $10,000, not cheap. The common fee that I have paid, for example, is about $3,000, but it can be as much as 10, 20. And then the paper is free for everyone. This is what we call open access, right? So there are some journals where you pay a very high fee and your paper is open to everyone. Okay, so it's a good idea. Yes, it is. Usually those papers, they are highly cited. Why? Because everyone can click, open the paper. It's easy. The exposition of the paper is really increased. But then the editors realized this would be a mine of gold if they started to make journals where all the papers were paid, right? And if they could have many, many papers going on. So they started with these journals, and I must tell you, I have no idea. I'm still trying to figure out how they can keep the impact factor of these journals high. I have just an hypothesis, but I am not sure if this is what's going on. Why? Because if you open your journal to anyone that gives you money to publish in it, what do you have in this journal? Just crap, right? It's obvious. So how can you have an impact factor that's high with bad quality papers? I have no idea. But the point is, clearly, there are some journals nowadays that you pay and your paper is published with very low lack of rigorous peer review. They play with aggressive solicitation of manuscript. So I'm sure yourself, if not yourself, your boss is solicited every day. Oh, we are now making an issue of this subject. Should you contribute to a paper? Very aggressive, right? And the impact factors are fake. It's obvious, not possible, that you have a lack of rigor in peer review and your impact factor is really high, right? Obviously, the focus is on profit rather than in quality or in science. And most of these journals, they exploit the pay system, the open access system, for offering rapid publication without peer review. What is the problem of predatory journals? The problem is, today, you see a journal, sounds nice, sounds like in the topic of your research, everything looks fine, and you go submit your paper to that journal. Next year, oh, this was a predatory journal. We will not accept any papers from that. So, and you submit your curriculum, and you have papers in that journal, and that journal was banned as a predatory. What? Complicated. And that's why it's important for you to hear about these gossips sometimes, and etc., and stories, and say, because this is really what's going on. And I have a situation like that. I was presented to a journal from an American researcher that collaborates with me. Everything looks nice, etc. And not this particular journal, but the editor that has many journals in different fields. This editor was banned from another area that I work, which is cybersecurity. So this raised the red light. What? Oh no, let's not submit journals to this editor. I don't know. Imagine you invest time, resources, you pay, And at the end, this paper will be banned. Right? So there are some lists of predatory journals on the internet. I haven't seen one that is like official, but governments, for example, I have heard that countries have already published, they have already created lists like that of predatory journals, and you should be aware of them before selecting the journal. So when you finish your thesis work that you worked so hard, etc., and you are going to publish a paper, just Google the journal predatory, see if there is any link, any. It's just like when you're going to buy something on the internet that you don't know the company, etc. Just do some research before using it. So, preparation of the manuscript. So, what is the idea here? The idea is to just give you some suggestions on how to prepare your manuscript, your work. So, in the beginning, you can start with a draft of ideas and structure. Second, try to improve the clarity and coherence, refine the arguments, and the final version is language formatting. The revision is an essential part of the communication, and the idea is that all authors should read and approve the final versions before submission, right? Why? Because they all share the responsibility of the contents. In the past, it was just a nightmare to do that with many authors. Why? Imagine you send the document to these people. These people will do their suggestions. They will get back to you. You have to go one by one. And sometimes imagine if two different people suggested different things on the same part of the document. What do you do? So it's complicated, right? Nowadays, things are much easier with these online documents, right? So you take your paper, Google Drive, Office 365, Overleaf that I will show you, and you should make use of this possibility of having everybody editing the document at the same time. So one can see what the other did, etc. So this will make your life much easier. So the idea is to use these collaborative tools to track revisions and suggestions, and of course ensure that all authors they review the manuscript. Remember that they all share the responsibility. So my suggestion is to use platforms such as Google Docs and Overleaf so they can track their suggestions and revisions efficiently. So I show you here one example of this platform that I use. It's called Overleaf. Overleaf uses this LaTeX text processor that people sometimes are really afraid of it. But the idea behind LaTeX is simply more like HTML language. So in HTML, you have commands that you give, and these commands, they are processed into something. So this is a LaTeX paper, and this is the result of it. So journals, they use LaTeX to produce their magazines, right? But here, what you see here is kind of small, but I will tell you what it is. These are all the modifications I made in a paper that I'm editing. And here you have a check or a cross. So the author will see my name, my initials here, saying who did that. And if the person agrees, it just clicks in the check. If it disagrees, it clicks in the cross. And then the author can go through all the suggestions very quickly. So every tool that you have, Google Docs, Microsoft Word, they have such a thing implemented. It's just to figure out how to use it, right? And I strongly suggest you to try to learn how to do this in Word so you can share with your co-authors. So the idea is, when the paper is finished, you have to submit it, follow the journal template, check the references, ensure the figures and tables are clear, and verify formatting guidelines. So sometimes it's very common that you submit a paper and shortly after the editor gives back to you, oh, you didn't put the references in the format, or your figure has poor quality. So make sure this is all checked, because these technical errors, they delay the review process and they give you a negative impression that you didn't took care to prepare everything properly and etc. Right? So it's important to make sure everything was done correctly. The cover letter. Cover letter is a letter that you have to prepare to the editor, explaining what you are submitting. It's an important document that sometimes people just take an example in the internet and they put there and make anything. But of course, the idea is to briefly present the manuscript, explain why it's relevant to the journal, and highlight what is the main contribution. So it's an important document. And some cases, authors, they mention previous publications to show that they have already, it's not the first time they are publishing that. And also, one thing that can be very helpful to the editors is to suggest potential reviewers. As I mentioned, the amount of papers, they have increased exponentially in the past years because of AI, right? So nowadays, the journals are searching for reviewers. So if you give them already some suggestions, you're just helping them to find reviewers to review your paper. What happens next? What happens after you submit your paper? The manuscript will be screened by the editor, and it will start the peer review process. So the editor will find reviewers, will send your paper to these people. What are the possible outcomes? Accept, revise, reject. You fall in one of these three, right? The point is, when we have a rejection, we get really mad. And we try to not give much attention to what was written in the rejection letter, in the comments of the reviewers. What I tell you is, rejection is common in scientific publishing. Most of the papers, they have been rejected at some point. So the idea is to try to use the reviewer feedback to improve the manuscript. So sometimes you get the rejection letter, you just let it there for a day or two, calm down, and then try to improve the manuscript and respond to the reviewers. The response should be done by putting each comment of the reviewer, copy and paste, and give you the response below, and showing, I did that as you suggested, etc., etc. So sometimes it's also interesting to give the previous paper with what was changed. So for example, the editor suggested to you to add a paragraph. So you put this paragraph in a different color to highlight that you actually changed the paper. So the idea is never manipulate data just to satisfy the reviewers. Sometimes, for example, the reviewer will ask you to run another experiment. Oh, you have also to run the synchrotron experiment in this sample. Excuse me, but I cannot do that. This is outside, this is a common sense. It's outside the scope of this paper. I will do it later in another paper, right? but you have to answer all the comments respectfully. And I like this figure. The point is never give up, right? So you put a lot of time on it. You should just keep trying, submit to another journal if necessary. And if at the end is exhausted all the possibilities, just submit to another journal. This is part of life, right? Do you have any questions for this part before we start the? Yeah, so Mateus is telling that he gets lots of emails asking him to publish his paper in some journals, and when he checks, journals are predatory. So it's true. Any questions? No questions. Can we keep going? Okay, we are a bit tight in time. I will go through the second part, the responsible use of artificial intelligence, which is just an introduction to the next part of the next class. So, AI guidelines. Why these AI guidelines are necessary? And right now, CI University is trying to prepare such a guidelines. It's important for you, once these guidelines are ready, for you to read them. Why? Because after the November 2022, ChatGPT was released, is the most downloaded software in the history of computer science. And it has increased clearly the amount of research and academic writing. But there is a lack of universal standards, and of course it's important that we have responsible and transparent practices. What is one of the main worries? That AI can generate plausible but incorrect information. This is really the most critical point. A phenomenon known as hallucination. So they gave name to this as hallucination. And this is all the time, right? So, for example, right before coming to this class, I am preparing a document, and I have to write a paragraph with informations from some PDF that can be extracted from a PDF. I could just take the PDF and select copy and paste with this box. But if I pay for ChatGPT, I just take to ChatGPT, okay, extract this information, put in this format. It did right for the first, for the second, for the third. When it was in the fourth, out of the blue, it just messed up all the information. It generated, it hallucinated, extracting information that was not there. The information was there, but at the end, he just invented some information. And if you are not aware of that, you may just use without checking, and this can be very bad. So, what is one point that underlines the large language models such as ChatGPT engine? Large language models are good at spinning into narrative form texts, drawing from plausible, reliable sources, using plausible facts, applying plausible theories, and viewing this through a lens of a possible critical analysis. So it's like if, what is the chance that this will go in a good direction? Seems to be very small. No? So Plausible, reliable resources. We don't know where the ChatGPT takes his knowledge. Plausible facts, using plausible theories. We don't know how they work. And at the end, it gives you an output. Should we trust that? Not a good idea. So AI has to be used as a tool, not as an author. So AI system, they may assist researchers. Human researchers remain responsible. AI cannot assume the accountability and should never be listed as an author, right? So researchers that are always fully responsible for the contents generated by AI. This is a point that you should exit this course with this in mind. If AI generated, and you reproduce it, you are the responsible. So the idea of transparency in use, as I mentioned, I see that's becoming more and more popular. People putting this paragraph in their documents. So they disclose the use of AI tools, right? So describe how AI contributed to that work. So for example, I have picked up this one from one document that I received. It says artificial intelligence tools are used during preparation of this manuscript. ChatGPT, specifically from OpenAI, was used to assist language editing and improving the clarity of the text. All the output generated by the tool were carefully reviewed and revised by the authors, who remain fully responsible for the content of the manuscript. So this is a kind of a disclaimer, acknowledgement, or a text that it starts to become popular in documents. So people are disclosing the use of AI tools. Acceptable uses. So first one, grammar and language correction. Brainstorming research ideas. So you're thinking about new fields and you go there and discuss with ChatGPT what he thinks and etc. Coding assistance, if you need to write programs, right? Sometimes can be very helpful. This point is the point that we will discuss in the next class is the literature exploitation and summarization. This point is a bit dangerous. So we will discuss about one paper, one document that the researchers did that. They picked up papers, gave to ChatGPT, asked to ChatGPT summarize the main idea, etc., and they looked at the results. And they figure out that in some cases it was okay, in some cases it distorted what was really written. So this is the point that we need to be aware of. These AI uses, they are accepted when they support, but they do not replace the researcher intellectual work, right? The idea is that you have always to verify the accuracy of the output of the AI tool. So what is the risk? For example, risky uses. Copying AI-generated text without verification. Should never do that. Using AI citations without checking the sources. Allowing interpret the results automatically. As I said, we'll discuss more in the next and last class that this can really distort what is written. And at the end, delegating critical thinking to AI tools. So that's the idea, right? AI-generated outputs, they contain factual errors, fabricated references, or biased interpretations. What is biased interpretation? AI output depends on what it was trained. Most of the AI tools, for example, ChatGPT, was trained in English and using text produced by Americans. So there's naturally a bias to the history, to the contents there. For example, in Brazil, they are developing a national chat GPT, and they ask who created the airplane. And the Brazilian chat GPT said, oh, it was Santos Dumont. And if you do that to chat GPT, it says the brothers right. This is an example of bias, right? So you have to be aware of that. The bias and hallucinations, all AI models, they reproduce training biases. AI may generate plausible but incorrect information. Fabricated references can occur. Human verification is essential. Here I brought just a quick definition of hallucination, which is this phenomenon in which language models generate plausible but false or unsupported information because it just predicted the next word, as you know, likely text, rather than retrieving verified facts. So this point is the way these codes that were created was just to generate fluent language, but not guaranteed truth. But this is changing, right? Now, for example, there is a much more expensive model called the reasoning model, in which ChatGPT generates the text and picks the answer and tries to verify it and then gives back the text again after verification. Of course, this is way more computationally expensive, but maybe in the future, the models will be way more accurate, right? So the reasoning is what I mentioned. They are doing this, what they call chain of thought, where they process the answer and verify and then checks logical consistency before giving the final answer. But this is very expensive. And sometimes you have to choose in ChatGPT, and as it costs computationally much more, you have just few answers with this kind of models that reduce hallucination. This other point is quite important, is the idea of privacy and data protection. And why I mentioned to you that you need to be aware of the institutional policies. As you probably know, the intellectual property that you generate doing your research at LPPI is not yours. You know that, right? You share that with at least your university and your boss. So, for example, if you discover something really, really nice and you make money out of that with a patent, at least it will be a third for you, a third to your boss, a third to the university. This is the kind of the worldwide norm. Each university has their own policies. So if the university says, do not share your research with ChatGPT, and you do not do that, you are basically committing a fault. Why? Because you do not own all of that, right? So you are exposing something that's not yours. Part of it is of the university. So this is really important to mention, because indeed you expose this information when you paste your thesis in ChatGPT, right? Sensing sensitive research data, unpublished manuscript, personal information, for example, that you expose to ChatGPT, may violate the regulations and institutional policies. Right now, as far as I know, there is no institutional policy of CY. It's just some suggestions or instructions, but they are developing it. And as soon as they develop, I believe you learn about them. Quick summary of this AI part and the presentation of today. Most of the ethical debates about AI use, they occur in the gray zone. You remember that gray zone, right? You have the misconduct accepted the gray zone. So most of the debates, they are now in this gray zone. What it means? Sometimes they may be banned. And if you did something and you published something that was in the gray zone, but then it became a misconduct, this may be a problem, right? That's the point. Basic assistance, such as grammar correction or coding help, is widely accepted, so no problem. At the other extreme, submitting AI-generated text without verification, it really violates research integrity. So you have the two extremes, allowed, not allowed. The challenge is what is in between, the gray zone. So I will just give you some examples in each zone. Acceptable uses: grammar and language correction, brainstorming research ideas, when they are in the beginning of developing your research, code assistance and debugging. If you wrote your code and you try to find the mistakes, and literature exploitation with verification. This is the acceptable. Gray zone: AI assisting paraphrasing of large text sections. This is exactly the example you gave, an abstract. So you took an abstract presenting in a conference. Oh, I have another conference in, tell me a beautiful place, in Madagascar, and I want to go. I didn't have time to prepare my abstract. Just take your abstract, ChatGPT, rephrase my abstract. Gray zone. It's your abstract, you take a look, but it may contain some other works, etc. AI-generated summaries without careful verification, AI-assisted drafting of manuscript sections, and also heavy reliance on AI for literature synthesis. Right? That you just take what AI did as granted and just keep going. And clearly anti-ethical use: submit AI without review, using fabricated AI citations, allowing AI to generate or interpret research results without validation, and of course listing AI as an author or hiding its use, right? So it's a misconduct, considered a misconduct. As I mentioned to you, I have friends already that I evaluated the work and say, why you do not submit? No, this journal is asking if you use AI. I just prefer not to tell. It's already happening, right? So take home message for today's class: ethics in scientific research. The scientific progress depends not only in the expertise, but also integrity and transparency. The misconduct, falsification, fabrication, plagiarism, they distort the knowledge and can mislead entire research community for a long time, as we have seen. The idea of ethics in scientific publication is that the author should take the responsibility for the integrity and the reliability of the research. In the preparation of scientific manuscripts, the idea is that you have really a productive interaction between all the co-authors, and it's important that they are listed on the paper, but also they gave their intellectual contribution. This is really important. And the responsible use of AI in scientific research is that the AI can assist the researchers, but the responsibility for the research process and the conclusions should always remain with us human authors, right? We should never delegate all the intellectual reasoning to a computer program. Here I have the two references I mentioned before, and thank you for your attention. Questions? So next class, the idea is I will try to open up a bit what is ChatGPT, what is the inside the box, of course, very superficially. It's a very complex code. And even, for example, the training is the secret of all these AIs. No one tells what they use to train their code, their model. And then we will discuss, probably it will be a shorter class because we will discuss the use of AI in this scientific brainstorming that I mentioned, right? So take AI to read papers, give the opinion, summarize, etc. How really AI or all these large language models, how really well they are understanding what is going on. Right? Is this really useful for you to give few papers to AI and ask AI to summarize what are the main ideas, etc. Of course, this is a subject that's changing all the time, right? Today, maybe the version number 4 is not good, but the number 5 will be completely different. So you have to keep that in mind, but I think it's worth the effort to look into that. Thank you for your attention.